In this hands-on lab that you and I get to do right now regarding auto deploy, it's important that we've gone through together the previous nugget on auto deploy concepts. So we're going to build on all that information from the concepts nugget, and we're going to focus here just on the implementation. So let's start off by logging on to the vSphere web client. And for this nugget, let's go ahead and log on as administrator at vSphere.local. There are some rights that are needed for enabling the services and working with auto deploy that our other administrator at nuggetlab.com does not yet have. And if you want to follow along in the lab, I would encourage you to do the same, and we'll supply our lab password and click Login. So here in the vSphere web client, logged on as administrator at vSphere.local, let's enable both the auto deploy and the image builder services. To do that, we're going to go ahead and hover over the home icon, and then from the drop down, let's go ahead and select administration. Here on the left-hand side in the navigation section for administration, under deployment, let's go ahead and click on system configuration right here. And then on the left-hand side under navigator, let's click on services. On this list of services, let's go ahead and click on the auto deploy service for vcsa.nuggetlab.com. And with that selected, if it wasn't running, this icon right here would allow us to go ahead and start it. Now for the convenience in the lab, I've already started it. And if you want this service to automatically start every time that vCenter comes up, all we would need to do is with the auto deploy selected, we'd use the actions drop down, and then from the drop down menu select edit startup type, and then simply click on the radio button for automatic so that the service starts automatically when the operating system starts. So with automatic selected already, we'll go ahead and click on OK, and then we're going to do the same thing for the image builder service. So here on the left-hand side, with services selected, if we go down to Image Builder and click on the Image Builder service, if it's not running, we'd go ahead and click on the icon right here, the little Go icon to start it. And then, very similar to what we did with the Auto Deploy service, if we click on the Actions drop-down, and then from the drop-down, click on Edit Startup Type, we could go ahead and click on the Automatic Radio button so it automatically starts when the vCenter Server appliance starts. So with the Automatic Radio button selected, we can click on OK. And then what we'd have to do is we would log out and log back in order to see the auto deploy functionality in the vSphere web client. Now in our case, because the auto deploy was already enabled, we can save ourselves the step of having to log out and log back in. So we can just hover over the home icon, and from the drop down we can click on home, and notice right here we have an icon that's now going to show up because the service is running for auto deploy. It's also here on the left hand side with auto deploy, and if we hover over the home icon, we also have it here on the drop down as well for auto deploy. So let's click on auto deploy. And with auto deploy selected, we have 4 tabs. The first is software depots. And it's in software depots that we're going to have software available to us. For example, images or vSphere installation bundles, VIBs. And I've got a couple that I placed here. I've got one for VMware. And as part of that depot, it includes a URL to an online software depot from VMware. So currently that little X next to the software depot represents that that's not reachable at the moment. So in a production environment with a working internet connection and the correct URL, we can click on image profiles. It will give us a list of everything that's in that software depot regarding image profiles. And if we clicked on software packages, it will give us the individual components regarding software packages that were available via this software depot. I also created a custom depot, but neither of those are going to show up by default. We need to add them. So let me walk you through 2 ways of getting additional software depots in our vSphere environment. This green up arrow right here is the shortcut for import software depot. So for example, if someone had sent us a zip file with a collection of images and software, we could take the zip, use the import button, and import from that zip. So let's do that. We'll click on the green up arrow for import software depot. We'll give it a name. Let's call this Las Vegas Depot or LV Depot. And then for the actual file we're going to import from, let's click on Browse, and I put a zip file right on our desktop. So on the left-hand side here, if we click on Desktop under Quick Access, here's an ESXi 6.5.0 standard. It's a zip file. If we click on Open, and with that specified, if we then click on Upload right here, it'll upload that .zip from our management computer into vSphere. More specifically, into vCenter. So it can become part of a software depot that we have access to inside of vCenter. So the upload was successful. We'll click on Close. And now if we clicked on this Las Vegas depot here, over on the right with the image profiles selected, if we click on the ESXi 6.5.0-standard, and let's scroll up just a little bit here, it's showing us the individual components that are going into that as part of that image right here. And if we clicked on software packages, it's going to show us the software packages associated with this depot. Now, another way to create a software depot inside of vCenter is to use this icon right here to add a software depot as opposed to import. So with a little plus symbol in the upper left-hand corner of this shortcut, let's go ahead and click on it to add a software depot. If we wanted to add an online depot that was reachable, we specify a name and the URL for it. Or if we wanted to create a custom depot, which we could then populate with images and software, we could click on the Custom Depot radio button, and let's call this one Image Depot. And then we'll put at least one image in there so it's actually worth something, and then we'll click on OK. So if we click on Image Depot, at the moment it's empty, there's no image profiles. And if you already have existing depots, whether they're online or they're from a zip file, if we want to copy current images, for example, from an existing depot, it's really simple. Check this out. If we click on Las Vegas Depot, and then we click on the ESXi 6.5.0-standard that's in that depot, we have some options including clone. Now the same options are here if we right-click on this image, including the clone option. So if we clone this image, let's do that right now. We'll click on clone. We can give it a name, and for this demonstration, let's just leave the clone of ESXi 6.5.0-standard. That way we'll remember when we see that name where it came from. We're cloning it from another software depot. The vendor is VMware, so we'll type that in. And then it's asking us, where do you want to put this cloned image profile? And let's go ahead and put it into our currently empty image depot by selecting it from the drop-down and clicking on Next. So here it's showing us the available software packages and how many are currently selected in this tab, which are all of them. And if we didn't want to include some of these software packages, we could just go ahead and remove the checks. We have the option of selecting exactly what we want right here. So I'm going to go ahead and leave everything selected and click on Next. It's giving us a summary of what it's about to do, and we'll click on Finish. And now, if we click on our Image Depot, we have the cloned image of the ESXi 6.5.0-standard, and we could use that image or any other valid ESXi image from an image profile as part of our auto deploy. And while we're right here, another really cool feature that we could do is we could also extract from an image here inside of a software depot. Case in point, if we wanted to go ahead and extract this ESXi 6.5 image, we could select it, use this down arrow, which is a shortcut for export the selected image profile as an ISO or zip. Click on that export down arrow. Specify if we want an ISO or a zip. I think the zip is going to take a little less space because of the compression. And then simply click on generate image. And that's now in the process of exporting. So if we didn't want to wait for this to finish, we could always just use these two right arrows in the upper right hand corner to minimize and finish this work later. It's still working in the background. It's now sitting here in the work in progress. And we could click on the recent tasks in the bottom left just to keep an eye on it. And we could go about doing other things while we're waiting for this to finish. Great, so now that it's done, we'll go ahead and minimize recent tasks. Let's go back to our work in progress up here in the upper right. We'll click on that once. Then we'll go ahead and select our existing work in progress by clicking on it. It brings us back to this window. And now we have the option of downloading the image. So if we click on download image, it's going to download it from vCenter to our local PC. So in the bottom left-hand corner here, it's now downloading that zip to our local computer in our downloads folder. And we'll close our export window here as well. And then we can minimize our work in progress as well. All right, so now that we have software depots and we have at least one image that we can use as part of auto deploy, let's go ahead to our next step, which is to set up the rules. So if a device boots from the Network Bootstrap program, reads the configuration file, and then connects over to the auto deploy server, the vCenter server appliance, providing that role, if we have multiple image profiles, which one should be handed down to that PXE booting ESXi host? And the way we control that is by setting up rules. Now, if a host connects over to the auto deploy server and it doesn't match any of the rules, it's going to show up here in the Discovered Hosts tab right here, which is like a holding tank for ESXi hosts that are trying to do auto deploy but aren't matching any rules. And if we want to see the hosts that have been deployed, we can use this tab right here for deployed hosts. And to set up the rules, we're going to go back to the Deploy Rules tab. So if we want to create a new deployment rule, what we'd do is click on this icon here, which is the New Deploy Rule shortcut. We'd give it a name. And just for fun, let's name this Looking for Lucky.104 rule. And the reason we're going to name it that is because it's going to remind us what this does. So that's the name of the rule. And regarding the criteria, here's what we could do. We could click on the second radio button, which says hosts that match the following pattern. And then from the drop down, we could go ahead and specify what we want to match on. And there's lots of options: UUID, vendor, serial number, MAC address, IPv4 address. And for this demonstration, let's go ahead and select IPv4 and put in the IPv4 address of 192.168.1.104. So once this rule is created and activated, a PXE booting device trying to boot from the auto deploy server, if it has the IP address of 192.168.1.104, it'll match this rule. And as a result, it'll have the image profile and the host profile that we associate with this rule. Now, one of the questions might come up is, well, Keith, how do you control that the new ESXi host is going to have this specific IP address because it's doing a PXE boot? And the answer is we can do that with DHCP reservations. So, and I'll show you that here in a moment. So with DHCP, if we know what the MAC address is of the host, we can assign that a specific IP address during the DHCP process and move forward. The other option, of course, would be to base it on the MAC address. And if we already know the MAC address, we could have the MAC address be part of the rule instead. Either way works great. We're going to use IPv4 for this example and click on Next. Next, it's asking, hey, which image profiles do you want to use? Let's use the one that's in the brand new Software Depot that we just created. So from the Software Depot dropdown, let's select Image Depot. And inside that Image Depot, there's the clone of the ESXi 6.5.0 that we just created a few moments ago. So with that selected, we'll go ahead and click on Next. And now it's asking us, hey, which host profile do you want to use for all the hundreds of settings that you might want specifically on this ESXi host? Now, it just so happens that we do have a single host profile that we created back in an earlier nugget when we focused on host profiles. And at the time, we created a host profile just for compliance. We created the host profile, we made sure the NTP settings were exactly how we wanted, and then we ran a compliance check against every host in our cluster, and we remediated one of them that had different settings. Well, the cool thing about host profiles is they're not just for breakfast anymore. We could use them as part of auto deploy. So if we had a host profile called Perfect, and it had the hundreds or thousands of settings that we wanted a new ESXi host to have, we could go ahead and simply select that quote-unquote perfect host profile as part of the auto deploy. Now, there are a few things that you cannot configure via a host profile. For example, link aggregation control protocol in conjunction with a distributed switch. That's an example of one of the features that can't be implemented through a host profile. However, most of the configuration that we would want on an ESXi host, we can actually do through a host profile. So in our case, we only have one called the host profile for NTP. So with it selected, we'll go ahead and click on Next. Next, it's asking us, hey, where do you want to drop this ESXi host? And we could put it in the Las Vegas data center directly. We could put it in cluster 1. Or let's do this. Let's use the double right arrows in the upper right hand corner of this wizard, which will minimize this over into the work in progress. So we can come back to that in a moment. And let's create a new folder just for our auto deployed hosts. So we'll click on Host and Clusters over here on the left. Let's right click on the Las Vegas Data Center, LV-Data Center. And from the Actions menu for LV Data Center, let's hover over New Folder. And from the submenu, let's select New Host and Cluster Folder. And for the lab, let's name this Recently Auto Deployed ESXi Hosts and click on OK. So here's our folder. Currently it's empty. If we go back to our work in progress up here in the upper right by clicking on it and then selecting our new deploy rule, it'll take us back to where we left off. And regarding location now of the new ESXi host, if we expand the Las Vegas Data Center, there we have the recently auto deployed ESXi hosts. If we click on that, that's where it'll put the new ESXi hosts that are auto deployed. So with that selected, we'll click on Next. And here's a summary. This is our rule name. This is the image profile that we're going to stream down to that host. Here's the host profile with the configurations we want that host to use. At the moment, it's just going to configure NTP, but that's okay as a demo. And the location is this folder inside of our vCenter hierarchy. And the rule applies to any hosts that have this IP address ending in .104. And we'll cause that to happen by doing a DHCP reservation based on the MAC address of the host that's booting. So with that in place, we'll click on Finish. Let's also go ahead and minimize the work in progress up here in the upper right. And if we click on Recent Tasks, here we have the Create Rule process. And this takes a few minutes. So let's let that cook. And while that's cooking, let me share with you what I have set up in our lab regarding DHCP and DNS so you can see those pieces as well. So currently I'm in full screen mode. I'm going to do F11 to take me out of that. And let's minimize our browser. And here on the taskbar, there's an icon for Server Manager right here. Let's go ahead and click on Server Manager on this Windows server, which we're using as our management station. So we'll give Server Manager a moment to initialize. And let's click on the Tools menu here in the upper right-hand corner. We'll click on Tools. And from the drop-down, let's go ahead and click on DHCP. And just for clarity, I'm going to expand the DHCP Manager full screen and reorganize it just a little bit so it's a little easier to see. So if we expand our server, expand IPv4, and expand the scope for the 192.168.1 network, if we click on Address Leases, currently it's showing us the client IP address of 192.168.1.104 for a host name of ES6i-4, and it currently says reservation inactive, and that's because the host hasn't booted up yet. It also shows here the unique identifier, which is the MAC address. So when a DHCP client does make a request for an IP address, if it's got this MAC address ending in 4401, the DHCP server is going to hand out this specific IP address of .104. And then if we expand the reservation section to take a look at that reservation, this is showing us the options that are going to be handed out. So we're going to hand out a default gateway of .1. We're going to hand out a DNS server, which is this computer at .100. It's also going to hand out the name of this file right here, which is undionly.kpxe.vmw-hardwired. And that is the network bootstrap program file that's provided as part of the auto deploy service from VMware that we want a PXE booting client to go ahead and load initially so it can start the auto deploy process. Also associated with that, there's a little tramp file that indicates the auto deploy server, which is vcsa.nuggetlab.com. So it's really important that DNS is currently working for all your devices in vSphere. The DHCP server is also going to hand out as an option, option 66, which is the IP address of the boot server. That's the TFTP server that has this file along with the associated configuration file that the PXE booting client can then go ahead and use. So that is currently in place on the DHCP side. If we minimize the DHCP manager, and from Server Manager, let's go back to the Tools menu from the drop-down. Let's select DNS, Domain Name System. And if we expand the forward lookup zones and expand nuggetlab.com, here we have an entry, which I placed here, for ESXi-4 in the domain nuggetlab.com, which means that anybody who's using this DNS server can resolve ESXi4.nuggetlab.com to that IP address. I also set up a reverse lookup for the 192.168.1 network that allows this DNS server to do reverse lookups as well. So if somebody asks, hey, who's the name behind 192.168.1.104, the DNS server can respond with, hey, that's the host ESXi-4.nuggetlab.com. So the great news is this: the DNS and the DHCP specifics on the Windows Server side is already set up and functioning. And if you're interested in learning more about specific networking services on the Windows side, there's a full course on that. It's 70-741. It's Networking with Windows Server 2016. Feel free to check that out for any nuggets that you have specific interest in. For example, DNS specific, or DHCP, or DFS. Or in a Windows specific environment, the auto deploy functionality on the Windows side for Windows clients. All right, so let's minimize the DNS manager as well. We'll minimize Server Manager. And let's go back to our vSphere web client and verify whether or not it is complete. And it is. Okay, so the rule is created. Fantastic. The other challenge is to make sure that the rule is activated, because it's not activated by default. So to activate that rule for auto deploy, we'll go ahead and hover over the home icon. And then from the menu, let's just go directly to auto deploy from the drop down. Okay, great. So currently we have the rule here, but it's not active. So we'll go ahead and click on activate/deactivate rules. Click on our rule here in the bottom side. Click on activate, which moves it to the activate section. Click on next, verify the details, and then click on finish. And this rule is now active. Fantastic. So one of the pieces that we need to solve also is the boot files, the network bootstrap program that's going to be on our TFTP server. And the vSphere web client has made it really easy to get that information. Over here on the left, if we click on the host and clusters, here in the navigation pane, if we click on the vcsa.nuggetlab.com, our very topmost object here in our vCenter environment, and then if we click on the configure tab regarding vcsa.nuggetlab.com, under settings, we have an option right here for auto deploy. So if we click on auto deploy, so it's indicating right here the name of the network bootstrap program, the one that's provided by VMware, which also is the exact option 67 that we have configured on our DHCP server. So if we wanted to get this file and the associated configuration information from vSphere to place on our TFTP server, what we could do is just download it right here. So if we click on the link for download TFTP boot zip, so we'll go ahead and click on that to do it. This is coming to us via HTTPS from the vCenter Server Appliance, which we still don't trust its certificate from our browser perspective. So we'll click on Advanced, scroll down, and click on Proceed to vcsa.nuggetlab.com, at which point it's now downloaded that zip file. So if we right-click in the bottom left-hand corner here on that zip file, and then click on Show in Folder. So let's go ahead and expand it. So if we select Deploy-TFTP and we right-click on it, and then from the Windows menu, select Extract All, and click Extract. It's now showing us that folder, and it's got a lot of files here, including this bad boy right here, and also this tramp file. So we can just take all this content, put it in our TFTP server, and then the PXE booting host would go ahead and load this file. It would also load a configuration file, as instructed as part of this network bootstrap program. So for the lab environment, instead of having a separate TFTP server, I am going to cheat just a little bit, and we are going to go ahead and double up. Because we already have the vCenter Server Appliance right here at .111, let's also just use the TFTP service on that vCenter Server Appliance. And that way we don't have to bring up a separate TFTP server in our lab environment. So to leverage our vCenter Server Appliance just for the lab, as a TFTP server as well, let's go ahead and minimize the vSphere web client. On the left here, on the desktop of our Windows computer, let's go ahead and double click on PuTTY. And I have an entry here for vCSA. If we click on that and click on load, it shows us the address, which is 192.168.1.111. I've got SSH enabled at the vCenter Server Appliance. If we click on open, this will open an SSH session to that appliance. We'll log on as root. We'll supply our lab password, press enter, and now we're connected via SSH over to the vCenter Server Appliance. We're going to use the third option to launch a bash shell by simply typing in shell, S-H-E-L-L, press enter. And now we're logged on as root at the vCenter Server Appliance at the command line interface. So if we did a pwd to verify where we are in the file system, we're in the root folder. If we did a more space slash etc etc slash sysconfig slash atftpd, which is an acronym for advanced TFTP, and then the D is for daemon, and pressed enter, it's going to show us the contents. And the part I'm interested right here is the directory, which is var lib tftp boot. And if we were to look at the contents of that var lib tftp boot folder, which we could do with an ls space and then putting that path in, and then pressing enter, we might notice some familiar files, including this guy right here, and the tramp file, which leads me to believe that vCenter Server Appliance is just begging us, hey, just use me as a TFTP server. I'm ready to go. And that's mostly true. It is almost ready to go. There's a couple of tweaks we need to do. Number one, we need to start the TFTP daemon or service so that it can respond to TFTP requests. So we can check the status of the service with service atftpd status and press enter, and that is currently not running, so we could go ahead and start it. We use the up arrow key, and instead of the status command, we'll type in start. Press enter, and then we'll hit the up arrow key a couple times, check the status again, and that looks much better. So in a production environment where we have a TFTP service available outside of the vCenter Server Appliance, we would just extract the files from the zip we downloaded, place them on our production TFTP server, point to that server in our DHCP options, and we're good to go. So for the lab, now that we have the files in that folder and the service is running, we also want to make sure that we're allowing the request to come in. So TFTP uses UDP at the transport layer. It also uses the well-known port of 69. And if we want to make sure that port is allowed to the vCenter server appliance, we can allow that with iptables, which is a Linux-based construct, iptables is. And for more Linux-specific training, I would encourage you to check out any of our Linux courses at CBT Nuggets as well. So with iptables, if we do a -h for help, it'll give us the options and syntax for this command. And what we're going to do with iptables is we're going to use a -A, which means append. Then we'll type in port_filter, and then a lowercase p for protocol. We want to specify UDP. Then lowercase -m for match, and we want to match on UDP. And a --d port for destination port, and that destination port is the well-known port for TFTP, which is 69 space lowercase j, and then accept in uppercase and press enter. And that should allow the incoming TFTP requests to be responded to by the running TFTP service on this vCenter server appliance. So we can type in exit and exit one more time to go ahead and close our PuTTY session. And now we're back at our Windows management computer. And with all those pieces correctly configured, we're done. Ta-da! Time for the next nugget. All right, it would behoove us to actually verify that it works. So to test that, I have a fourth machine called ESXi-4 that's here in our lab environment. So on the right-hand side in the control panel for the lab, if you click on ESXi-4, it's going to look something like this. This machine is currently powered off. So when you're ready, let's go ahead and click on Start to start that virtual machine. We'll click Yes to go ahead and confirm, and we'll see it boot up. And check out this MAC address, 4404. Now this host has multiple network adapters, and 4404 is not the one I set up the reservation for in DHCP. Also, this network adapter isn't even connected to the same broadcast domain as our management network. So it's going to time out on this first one because it's not the right adapter. So it quits. Then it goes to the next adapter, which does have the address ending in 4401. It gets an IP address from DHCP. It's now doing a download of TFTP from our TFTP server. That's successful. Here it's specifying the actual name of that file. And now it's doing a boot request over to the auto deploy server, and that is in motion. And there it goes. So through the magic of editing, I sped up this process quite a bit. So let's go back to our management station and take a look at the vSphere web client. So back in the vSphere web client, if we hover over the home icon and then from the drop down, click on hosts and clusters. And then on the left-hand side, if we take a look at the recently auto-deployed ESXi host folder, there's our ESXi-4. If we click on ESXi-4 and then click on the summary tab, it has a few nice reminders for us. No core dump target has been configured. And ESXi-4 can't do that on a local hard drive because it doesn't have one formatted. That's because it booted right off the network via the auto deploy. No data stores have been configured, local or otherwise. And again, we could add the configuration for host bus adapters and access to network-based data stores. And we could have those settings associated with a host profile that we linked up with that rule as part of auto deploy. The default password hasn't been changed. That's because we didn't change it. And these system logs are on non-persistent storage. Once again, because it doesn't even have a usable, at this point, hard drive that the ESXi host can use. And for the purposes of our lab, we're not going to keep ESXi-4 around. So if we want to get rid of him gracefully, we can right-click on ESXi-4. From the drop-down, we can hover over maintenance mode and then select Enter Maintenance Mode. And that's not a bad practice. That way, if by chance there was a VM running on it, it would give us an opportunity to make sure we're going to evacuate any VMs from that host. So we'll click on OK, which will put ESXi-4 into maintenance mode. And let's go ahead and remove him completely from our topology. And we can do that by right-clicking on ESXi-4, and from the Actions menu for ESXi-4, selecting Remove from Inventory. And that's going to remove him from vCenter. We'll click on Yes, and that host no longer shows up as a resource here in vCenter. So have some fun with the labs, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.